Oya YouTubers, this is Andu, and I'm here with my first mod snapshot video. You can see I'm starting small here with a sidearm, obviously a Nerf Hammershot, and this is what I simply call my functional Hammershot. What I'm trying to do with this build is make something as comfortable and practical as possible. So that's what's driving the entire design. The second thing you will likely notice about this blaster is the cylinder. This is a 7-shot 3D printed cylinder. Now this is the original from a seller in China, and this cost me $40 US. Now you can get much simpler, in different styles, so some are simpler, some are more complex in the styling of the cylinder, but you can get cheaper versions of this cylinder locally within Singapore, Australia, and the United States, probably somewhere over in Europe, the rest of Europe as well. But this is the original as far as I know. And so you can get these faster and cheaper from local suppliers, but I loved the look of this, and before everyone else came out with a particular version of the 7-shot 3D printed Hammershot cylinder, this was the original. This is what was available, and I really wanted one. And I think it both looks very cool, it functions beautifully, and trying to make this blaster as practical as possible, 2 extra shots in a blaster that you can wield with one hand. 7 shots, that's 1 shot more than a strong arm. I just love it, and it was something this build absolutely needed. So the dart fit, well, is a little loose, unfortunately. That is something I do plan to remedy. Now, of course, this is actually an old dart, so I'm going to probably toss that one away. New darts that aren't particularly worn fit in there much better. It takes a little more force to pull them out than this older dart did, where it could basically just fall out. So with new darts, it does function beautifully. You can still turn it by hand, and the air restrictor, to my knowledge, is still functional. So I'm pretty happy with that. As far as the actual priming goes, it works beautifully. And I don't know what was up with that shot. There we go. I haven't played around with this too much. I've never even screwed it back together. So far, it's just in the build process, but I'm pretty happy with how the cylinder's performing. So that was the second thing you likely noticed. The first is this handle, and this is what I'd like to spend some real time on. This is basically what drove this build, aside from the cylinder. I wanted to make a more comfortable handle for the Hammershot, and obviously this is off of a Nerf Roughcut. And I just think this is so much more comfortable. It fits my hand so much more beautifully, more ergonomically than the stock Hammershot handle, which I do like. But this one is just so nice to hold. And so you might be wondering, how did I do this? Well, that's one of the reasons I never screwed this back together. Let's take a look. So I'm going to open up the blaster. And inside, I'm going to pull out the cylinder. I'm going to pull out the internals, and here you can get a look at how the integration was done. I started by connecting by cutting the handle off the Hammershot and off the Roughcut, and I cleared this section out almost completely, except for some support pieces and some screw points. You'll see I really did ream this out. So what I did then was integrate these with the shell halves together with just a little bit of DevCom plastic welder. It's an epoxy I get from Ace that works beautifully on plastics. It is honestly, for a $5 tube, just about the best stuff you can get your hands on off the shelf. And so I put a little up here and a little down here, held the blaster shells together, and of course, to try and get everything lined up properly, I did it while the halves were assembled like this, held it in place until it's set, just took a couple of minutes, and voila, that was connected. So then what I did is I came in and I filled in this area down here with some epoxy putty, in this case PC Plumbers, and then I started getting a little more creative. On this side of the blaster shell, you'll notice on the corresponding side of the internals, there is no flat place. for me to push anything up against. On one side, I've got this large flat surface to work with. The other, I've got a spring in here, and I don't want any epoxy putty to touch that. So what I did is take a little thin sheet of aluminum. I cut it, and it was thin enough to actually cut with scissors. So those are now my hobby scissors. They're going to get really dull with use, I'm sure, but for the moment they're working. And I cut this piece to fit here, and then I DevConned this in place. So that was there. And then what I did is I came in on the other side, and I tried a new epoxy putty that I've never used before that is very common in modeling circles called Milliput. So this is the basic gray-yellow Milliput, and it takes a long time to set and cure. It gave me a nice long work life, and I was able to mold this in. You can see I even molded it in over here, trying to bring all the lines together. And so what this requires more of is some sanding, both with hand and careful work with a Dremel or other power sander. Just fine details to blend this all together before it gets painted. But that is nice and solid, and I'm pretty happy with how that side turned out. This side was simultaneously easier and a little more tedious. What I actually did with this side, you'll see there's no metal plate up here. You can see the Milliput showing right through. And the way I did that, again, I had this flat surface here on the right side of the Hammershot internals. I don't think there you can kind of see it, the sheen. I coated this whole thing in silicone grease. So what I did, when I wanted to build up the epoxy putty on this side, I dropped the internals in, and you can see that did require some modification of the shell. I removed a little bit of extra stuff here because the handle was attached just a little differently than I planned. So I really didn't need to remove that much, but I did remove some. And I dropped this in, so all that grease was on the other side of this flat panel here. And what I then did from the other side is fill in all of this Milliput. And again, it all needs to be sanded and smoothed out, that sort of thing. But I placed that in there. And what that did is it pushed up against this flat surface through the hole in the shell here, through this triangular hole, and it cured. But it didn't stick to the plastic on the inside because of that grease. It's a wonderful trick, and I don't even remember who I learned it from. But if you don't know it, you need to try it. Epoxy putty will not stick to grease. Well, maybe it sticks to a little bit of it, but the grease itself won't stick to anything else. So that gave me this nice flat surface inside, helped fill this gap without interfering with the internal function of the spring or the rest of the Hammershot internals. So that turned out really well. But then there was another problem. On the stock Hammershot handle, this whole assembly, mind you, it is falling under coming under a great deal of force, kind of like that, with the Hammershot spring when it gets pulled down. And that was actually pretty stupid of me to do there. But when the spring pushes down on the bottom of the handle, this whole thing flexes over to the side. And it jumps out, just like you saw. And it was just kind of floating in there. And I wanted that to be sturdy. So I used the same trick. I covered this in silicone grease. And then I placed some epoxy putty in here where I wanted it to be supported at the very bottom. Just enough to create a nice little rest. And so I placed that in there, in this case PC Plumbers, because it sticks to plastic well and it's very strong and it cures very quickly. Placed this in here, held it where I wanted it to be, and there I have a custom formed, very sturdy rest point for the Hammershot internals. So this just drops in. Once you get it aligned properly, of course. There we go. Something like that. And now that is not going anywhere. The other thing I did with this build, you'll see that I minimized the trigger. This is not functional. This was just for play. I plan to build this up with just a little bit of epoxy putty, and this is going into a different blaster. This is not a war functional modification, because theoretically something could get in here and jam the trigger, including my own finger. So I plan to have a stock Hammershot trigger on here with the full blade that prevents anything from going through behind the trigger at some point. So that is just about everything I've done to my functional Hammershot. I am very pleased with how it turned out. It feels very comfortable. Even though the integration is very slightly misaligned, I'm still very happy with it. It fires well. It just has a stock spring right now. I might give it a stronger spring. I haven't decided. But I'm kind of thinking, you know, Vanguard orange and blue paint scheme from Destiny. Go look up Vanguard Armory weapons from Destiny and let me know what you think of that. In any case, I'm about to run out of time. That is my functional Hammershot. Thank you for your time, and keep your stick on the ice.